Will President Putin of Russia and President Zelensky of Ukraine meet face-to-face as teased by President Trump? Well, neither of those two actually seem that keen about doing it. We'll discuss when it might happen on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the BBC in Salford, just in the northwest of England. And that is because I am standing in for Matt Chorley on 5 Live all this week, 2 till 4. Which means my seat is being kept warm in the Newscast studio in Broadcasting House by James Landale. Hello, James.
Hey, Adam.
Is that what we know in the trade as a holiday beard that you are sporting?
It is a lazy beard, but yes, a holiday beard.
And are you going to keep it?
That is out for debate at the moment. The general consensus seems to be sort of, I was hoping for Silver Fox, but I fear Captain Birdseye is predominating at the moment amongst my friends and peers and family.
And you will discover that men's facial hair is the kind of physical thing people are still happy to criticize in public. Most other things are off limits, but men's facial hair is very much not.
Point. Yeah. Although one person did say something very nice. They said they thought it made me look younger, which was counterintuitive. But they said it's because facial hair is a young person's thing these days, and therefore it made me look younger. So I accepted that.
We'll let Newscast viewers on our YouTube channel decide. Right. Also joining us from Washington, D.C., someone else who's had a beard and for a bit longer is Vitaliy from Ukrainecast. Hello, Vitaliy.
Hey, Adam.
And also, please welcome to Newscast and, in fact, the BBC, because she's just joined us from NPR. It's Asma Khalid, who is going to be hosting the Global Story podcast when it launches on the 3rd of September. Hello, Asma.
That's right. Thank you. Good to be here.
Sorry to drag you away from the Global Story grindstone where you're trying to work out how to make a new podcast. At least you'll have loads of content. There's lots of global stories.
Yeah, there's no shortage of news. No shortage of news at all.
Before we dive into the news, though, with your many years of covering the White House for NPR, Asma, did you know there was a Make America Great gift shop that Donald Trump was showing to all the world leaders yesterday?
I did see that imagery, right, of all the MAGA hats laid out. But look, the White House, actually, if you do want some paraphernalia, does have some lovely gift shop stuff that you can get at the White House Historical Association. Not actually on hand at the White House, though.
There's always a lot of merch in Washington, D.C. American politics does merch a lot better than Britain. Right, James.
Can I just beg to differ on that front? As a proud possessor of a pair of House of Lords oven gloves, I can tell you there is a very distinguished gift shop in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords where you can even buy House of Commons baby grows. It's not just chocolates and whiskey bottles and all the rest of it.
And the speaker does an amazing bar of chocolate, actually. Right, James, my take on everything that happened in Washington on Monday after sleeping on it is just that it felt absolutely massive at the time because of the theatre and the process. But waking up this morning on Tuesday, I was like, actually, what has been achieved here, really?
Yes, there's been a bit of revisionism today. Before we get to that, I think it's first worth saying what was avoided. There was no big row. There was no big bust-up. Donald Trump deliberately chose to avoid taking the bait from some of the questions he was asked. There are quite a few leading questions. He could have picked up the ball and run with them. He chose not to. So there was a clear attempt on all sides to keep it convivial and positive and optimistic. So I think that, that in itself, the avoidance of row, the avoidance of controversy and dispute, is not to be underestimated. If you are a Russian and you are seeing a physical demonstration of transatlantic unity, that doesn't fill you with joy. So we should at least put that on the ground, I think, as a sort of, you could say it's a low bar, but at least, you've avoided something bad. But then in terms of your question, absolutely, where's the beef, where's the substance? On the two big sort of the moves, this idea of there being the potential for some kind of bilateral meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, and the second issue of American willingness to take part in some kind of post-war Ukraine security guarantees. Lots of questions, lots of uncertainties that we simply don't know the answers to.
And Asma, I'm now going to get you to earn your BBC bucks from analysing this interview that Donald Trump did on Fox News on Tuesday morning. We'll play a couple of bits of it. This is him talking about what the US contribution to the security guarantee in Ukraine post-peace deal could be. And the first thing you'll hear is the presenter on Fox News asking him questions.
What kind of assurances do you feel like you have that going forward and, past this Trump administration, it won't be American boots on the ground defending that border?
Well, you have my assurance, and I'm president, and I'm just trying to stop people from being killed, Charlie. Look, they're losing from 5,000 to 7,000 people a week in that ridiculous war that should have never happened.
So, Asma, do some interpretation for us then. What can we glean from that and other things he said and other things that have been said by people in the administration about what the US is, the security it might be willing to guarantee to Ukraine?
So I think the major headline that came out of President Trump's interview this morning, as you say, with Fox and Friends, was that it is likely, probably, he says, that the United States could offer some aerial support. That's the first I've heard of any inclination that the United States would provide any type of security guarantee if this all were to move forward. He did, as you heard him say, reiterate that he has no plans to put U.S. troops boots on the ground. I would say that to me is not a huge surprise, though, because this is a president who campaigned on the assumption, and it is very popular amongst a key part of his base, that the U.S. has been tethered to far too many foreign wars. He does not want to put boots on the ground, so that's not particularly surprising. But to get to your bigger point, like what does security guarantees actually mean? I think that is what we will possibly find out in the days, the weeks that come, and whether or not this is some sort of mirage. I mean, the one thing I will say about President Trump is that he often says things and then they are sometimes backtracked by administration officials, or they morph and they evolve. I think what is so striking to me, though, about the meetings yesterday was just the sheer number of times that security guarantees were brought up and suggested that it is a viable part of the conversation. And the reason I mentioned that is I was at that February meeting that went so south for Zelensky. And I remember going into that meeting, security guarantees was something that was going to come up, but that wasn't something President Trump wanted to talk about at all. All he wanted to talk about in that meeting was a mineral deal. So I would say the sort of arc of the conversation has shifted. Now, whether that's actually like real tangible security guarantees or just talk, we will find out.
And Vitaliy, I mean, Donald Trump's even just kind of contradicted himself here, because I remember one of the last things we were saying on Newscast when I was chatting to Sarah and Anthony on Monday night was he just posted that thing on Truth Social where, talking about security guarantees, he said the US was willing to provide coordination, which seemed a lot less than, well, what he said on Fox this morning, and a lot less than he seemed to be promising to Zelensky in person yesterday.
Well, talk is my take on it. So many words, and I look forward so much to some action, really, something that will stop people from being killed. Avoidance of row, that really is setting the bar low. It's true that, when I was at the White House yesterday, it was palpable, this determination of people trying not to sound confrontational. And I think, it's true that a catastrophe for Ukraine has been avoided, which is a good thing. I think the three leaders, Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, essentially they've bought themselves more time. However, during this time, people will die. In fact, by the end of us recording this episode, somebody will be killed in Ukraine. So that doesn't really move things forward. Listening to all those leaders at the White House yesterday, the main takeaway for me was that, their discussions focused on security guarantees, the possibility of a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. The only time when there was a suggestion of remaining differences was when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and then Emmanuel Macron of France, they said, well, actually, we still think a ceasefire is the next step forward, despite Donald Trump saying after meeting Putin, no, that's not necessary. Apart from that, it was sort of relatively good-natured. The problem is, we have absolutely no idea what security guarantees they discussed. At the end of the day yesterday, Zelensky held an unusual news conference, I thought, in the park outside the White House. It was getting dark, it was getting rainy, sort of. And he said funding for the Ukrainian army and weapons production in Ukraine was part of those security guarantees, as well as intelligence sharing. And when I asked him, okay, but what about new weapons packages from the United States? Whoever pays for them. What about more weapons for Ukraine, new weapons for Ukraine, more powerful weapons for Ukraine? Essentially, he gave me a non-answer, which tells me he doesn't really know either. So earlier today, he posted something on social media saying he continues working with partners about the details of these guarantees, but frankly, it doesn't really mean much to me. I don't think we know anything at all about the details of what they discussed, let alone what they agreed.
James, in terms of the actual process, though, of formulating the security guarantees, like that's taken a bit of a step forward today because the head of the UK Armed Forces, the chief of the defence staff, has gone to Washington to actually have some detailed conversations about this stuff.
Yeah, so look, we're clearly at the beginning of the latest stage of this conversation, because if you remember that, this is not starting from a standing start. Remember all those discussions earlier in the year when the so-called coalition of the willing were established, and we had that long debate about what are we going to call this? Is it a peacekeeping force? Is it a reassurance force? And then in those days, we were talking about American involvement being as a backstop. And so was that in terms of, logistical support, intelligence support, air support in terms of air, access to satellite information and things like that. So all of that's going to be sort of rehearsed again. There'll be more discussions about what role Turkey could play in terms of securing the Black Sea. There'll be more discussions that will be literally very technical ones about which air forces will provide which squadrons that will be located in which countries to the west of Ukraine, so they are able to provide some air cover. How will you rotate them? Which countries will go in which order? There's actually quite a lot of nitty-gritty, but some of that work has been done before. There's a lot of paper on this that already exists. So there are plans there. The key question is how does now that the Americans have been very public in saying that they are in principle prepared to engage in this, how does the American end of the operation fit into that? And I think that's what Tony Radakin is going to Washington to discuss.
And do we know that the coalition of the willing, which had mainly been European countries, had been talking to the US already about the US contribution to this? Or is this the US being sort of gradually being brought into the coalition of the willing?
I think the Americans and the Europeans and the coalition of the willing had been talking a long time, but at a sort of military level, technical level, because they were waiting for any kind of clarity coming out of the White House as to where, how far the American contribution could go. But on a military level, the Americans have been very closely tied to the European discussions.
Yeah. Asma, let's go back to the Trump interview with Fox and Friends. He was asked about sort of timeframes for all of this, and there's various processes here on different timelines. What was your take on how long things are going to take or what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I mean, well, we saw just actually probably as we sat down here to tape, the press secretary Caroline Leavitt here at the White House briefed reporters, or maybe she still is briefing reporters. She is saying that the next step in their view is that Putin and Zelensky will meet. Now, the question, of course, and Vitaliy, I'm curious to hear what you think, is whether Putin indeed wants to meet and sit down. The assumption from the White House is that such a meeting is possible. And then presumably after that meeting, if indeed both parties want President Trump involved, that there would be some sort of trilateral agreement.
Did you know what happens, Asma? The Ukrainian president's office has told the BBC that Vladimir Putin's suggestion was for Volodymyr Zelensky to come to Moscow and meet him there. Is that ever going to happen? I don't think so. it's one venue that is completely out of the question. Can you imagine going to the capital of the country that's been slaughtering your people for years? So I think what Vladimir Putin may be doing there is saying no to this meeting.
By
with
putting on terms, you're saying they're just so untenable
Absolutely.
to the Ukrainians. Yeah, so I mean, at this point, what you're hearing from the Trump administration, I think this is kind of apparent too by the actions we've seen from President Trump, is he has an extreme desire for peace. In his view, he just wants this war to be over. He has said this in many different ways, multiple times recently, that he thought this would be an easier war to wrap up and end. He wanted this war to be over several months ago. He promised on the campaign trail when he was running for office that he would wrap it up on day one, and it was proven far more difficult for him to do that.
And actually, James, it's interesting that we're now focusing on when will Zelensky and Putin meet, but the Russians and the Ukrainians have been meeting at different levels for a couple of months now.
Well, if you remember, they even met right at the beginning of the full-scale invasion and had various meetings on various borders. And I remember going to one in Antalya in southern Turkey. So there have been intermittent conversations throughout. There was some suggestion earlier today that before any kind of Zelensky-Putin meeting, there might be a Lavrov-Rubio meeting, a meeting at foreign ministerial level. The Russians quite often like to sort of, move up gradually rather than a massive escalation all the way to heads of government. But again, the key question will be is if these two leaders do meet, what are they going to talk about? What's the framework going to be? Because it will not be how can I put it, as unprepared as some of the Trump Putin meetings have been in terms of the lack of coordination that normally precedes any kind of high level engagement between heads of government. That has been lacking in quite a lot of this engagement so far.
So when we're talking about meetings between Russia and Ukraine, at whatever level, whatever venue, whatever subjects they discuss, whatever agreements they reach, I think it's important to remember that there absolutely have to be reasons to believe that this time around, Russia will keep its word. Because so far, starting from the very first years of Ukraine's independence, starting from the Budapest Memorandum, starting from the Treaty on Friendship and Cooperation of 1997, followed by numerous ceasefire deals, all of those key agreements have been violated. So the one thing that would make Vladimir Putin not violate any agreements reached with Ukraine would be the threat of response, meaningful response from the West. We can call it security guarantees, but at the moment, I'm just not seeing, we're talking about the coalition of the willing, but what is it able to do? I'm just not seeing any suggestions at all about, okay, Vladimir, if you do this, this will be our response, and this time around it's going to be crushing. Instead, we're talking about some vague equivalent of NATO's Article 5.
Can I ask you, though, on that, is part of this also, though, that that the United States, I guess I'm imagining from Trump's perspective also, is trying to tango with Putin, and Putin has made it abundantly clear that NATO membership and Article 5 being the crux of that is just fundamentally off the table. And if you're Trump and you want a deal at all costs and you just want peace, you're willing, in his view, to negotiate. And if this is the absolute hard line for Putin, Trump and his administration is saying, okay, well, then we're not going to put NATO membership or Article 5 on the table in any way. And they just want a deal.
I wonder why not.
I guess because in their view, Putin won't agree to a deal like that.
Well, yeah, but again, why not? I was listening to Donald Trump's interview with Fox today, and yet again, he wheeled out this tried and tested argument that I've been hearing from Russian state TV for decades, literally. Donald Trump said that Russia does not want an adversary, an opponent, or an enemy on its border, and he said that Ukraine's ambition to join NATO was insulting to Russia. But let's look at other Russian neighbors, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're NATO members, and Russia doesn't seem to be that worried about NATO being right there on the Russian border. After the full-scale invasion, Sweden and another neighbor of Russia, Finland, joined NATO. What did Vladimir Putin say? He said, well, we're not worried. So why is it that he is so strongly opposed to Ukraine joining NATO and not Finland, not Estonia, for example? I think is because he wants Ukraine to be defenseless. And NATO and its Article 5, as history tells us, is a pretty good deterrent.
James, my obsession from the last 24 hours has been some of the photos that came out of the events in the White House on Monday, and one in particular, which is the picture, and it's in black and white, of Presidents Trump and Zelensky looking at the map of Ukraine propped up on a sort of easel. And if you look at the map, it's an American take on how much land is being occupied by Russia and what percentage that is of each kind of oblast, of each region in Ukraine. What's your take on just what was going on with that map and that conversation that the two of them were having in front of it?
Well, as somebody who has produced an awful lot of maps for television news over the years, I am fully aware of the potential for error creeping in to these maps. So I think everybody has been scanning this map very, very closely to see whether or not it has involved any incorrections, any inexactitudes rather, and whether it is sending a signal in one way or the other. Look, on one level, it's good that Donald Trump, a man not famous for focusing on the detail, is in front of a map. And is looking at detail and can be, there's an opportunity for the Ukrainian president to explain to him precisely the importance of certain parts of the country and why, it's not a question of just sort of giving up some territory or using this curious phrase, land swaps, whatever the President Trump means about that. But it shows the sort of the risk, though, is that it shows that Donald Trump and the White House's mind is still focused on this as somehow a territorial dispute rather than one essentially about Russia seeking, as Vitaliy was saying, control over Ukraine, diminishing its army, securing some kind of political control over its leadership in Kiev, all of those root causes that Russian spokespeople constantly talk about. But on a very basic level, if they are at least talking in detail, that's something to be optimistic about.
On the subject of maps, at the White House yesterday, Ukraine's advanced party, if you like, the first Ukrainians to enter the White House, one of them was Pavlo Palisa, the deputy head of Zelensky's office, and he walked past us and he was carrying a huge rolled up tube, like a sheet of paper. And of course, everybody thought, oh, that's a map. He's bringing in a map, and possibly they're going to sit down and bring out their Sharpies and start drawing or redrawing borders and discussing what Ukraine...
Because that's always worked out well throughout history, hasn't it?
Well, exactly. So later last night, when Volodymyr Zelensky was giving his news conference, he mentioned that map. So this is the map that you were just discussing, James. And it was simply a map showing which parts of Ukraine were occupied by Russia. And Zelensky said that the Americans had a map of their own, which was different. So using what his aide Palisa brought into the White House, Zelensky said they were able to change the Americans' minds about what Ukraine controlled and didn't control at the moment. So sometimes it helps to have some visual aids, visual props. Yeah.
And also on that note, James, I thought it was so interesting that, there's this Twitter account that the UK have called Defence Intelligence or something like that, which occasionally pumps out kind of the British assessment of the situation militarily on the ground. I noticed they did a post on social media earlier this week saying for Russia to get full control of all the territories it's partially in control of now in Ukraine would take something like 4.4 years. Did you see that post?
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because that's almost like a tacit admission from the UK that the mission now is to stop Russia getting more as opposed to getting Russia out of the bits that it's got. I don't know, maybe if I'm reading far too much into one social media post.
That's really interesting.
To me,
I read it in a very different way. I read it as an illustration of how important this territory is militarily as a defensive buffer, and also its significance, namely that the idea of giving up something that would take Russia that amount of time to control and conquer shows that, this is not some trivial small piece of land, that can be sort of discussed in a sort of conversation looking at a map in the White House. This is, a fundamental piece of territory that's been fought over. Remember, there's been Vitaliy will tell you, they've been fighting around here for many, many years preceding the full-scale invasion.
Yeah, I just wondered if it was a sort of tacit acknowledgement from the UK that the conversation was going to be about, freezing the conflict line where it is. And that would be a bit of a change to the UK position. Right, Asma, one of the things you will learn from doing Newscast, and I'm sure you will also learn from when you start doing the Global Story, is that BBC podcast listeners ask very, very incisive questions, such as this one from Vanya, who sent us a voice note.
Hi there, my name is Vanya, and I was wondering whether you could fact check Trump's claim, which is being repeated on the news again and again and again, that he has settled 6 wars in the last 6 months.
The number kind of ebbs and flows. This morning on Fox and Friends, the president referred to 7 wars that he's resolved. Yesterday, during his meeting with Zelensky, I believe the number he cited was 6. So there's certainly some debate. I would also argue there's some debate linguistically over whether these are in fact wars that he's all referring to, or whether they are other conflicts and debates. But I'm going to go down to a list that I actually have kept tabs on my phone, so I do not misspeak here. But what the Trump administration is referring to are the India-Pakistan skirmish that we saw a few months ago, the Iran-Israel war, Thailand and Cambodia, I'm at 3, Armenia and Azerbaijan, 4, Rwanda and Congo, that's 5. Now, the other 2, I would say, are a little murkier to me. Sometimes Kosovo, and sometimes it seems Ethiopia and Egypt, which, to my knowledge, I think is more of a water dispute rather than a full-on war. So those are the conflicts that the president is speaking of that he has resolved. And notably, I think what's striking are the 2 biggest wars that he has inherited since he took office. The war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine are the 2 that remain unresolved to this day.
Excellent verification. Thank you very much,
he
Asma.
also misspoke famously when he was giving the list yesterday, when he referred to Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was a new country. He did correct himself, but the Democratic Republic of Congo was a new one.
James, lovely to see you and the beard.
Always a pleasure. I can't promise it'll be here next time, but it might.
Well, we might do an online poll to see if newscasters think you should keep it. Vitaliy, thank you very much, and actually, so good of you to just elaborate on that press point that Zelensky did outside the White House last night, because I think that's probably not got the attention it deserved in all the news coverage today. So, thank you for that.
It's a pleasure.
And Asma, your payment for all the hard work you've done is getting to do another plug for the Global Story.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We launched September 3rd. It's a show I hope you all tune into, because it's a show I deeply believe ought to exist in the world in this moment, with the goal of connecting what's going on in the world with what's going on in the United States. And frankly, within the American media landscape, I don't think a show like this exists. So I'm excited to help build it.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Great. That's high hopes. Good stuff. Excited. Asma, thank you very much. Break a leg. And that's all for this episode of this podcast, connecting all the dots around the world. And we will be back with another episode of Newscast very soon. Bye-bye.